Welcome to episode 28 of the ADHD Adults podcast. Sorry. I'm James Brown, the marginally less shit part of the podcast, although obviously shittiness is in the eye of the beholder. And I'm joined by a man who, with just a little bit of hard work, training, and a stylist, could maybe one day call himself mediocre. Dr. Alex Connor. Alex, hi.
Nuka nech.
What do I do with that?
I don't want to tell you what it is. I've gone too far this time.
Oh no! Is it Klingon? It's fucking Klingon, isn't it? That was always going to happen. Is it Klingon? That was always going to happen with you at some point in this podcast.
Yeah.
Oh God, I want to vomit all over the computer screen at the minute. Jesus Christ. Okay, I'm just going to speed through this because it's not funny. How are you, Al?
I'm very well, thank you, James. Yeah, having a very nice week. I'm really excited at the almost ridiculous but not exponential growth of the ADHD Adults podcast. I don't understand it. Literally tens of thousands of very, very strange people watching this. And we get so much correspondence in all sorts of things. I've been sent a letter from a Robert from Kidderminster. It says, "Dear Alex, long-time listener, first-time caller." Oh, this one's an imaginary phone call, not a letter. Anyway, he just shouted, "James is a cock," and put the phone down, which was rude.
He does that, though. He does do that. So that's the first one that's believable, Al, to be honest.
I've been sent a real letter, or we have, or a DM. Don't know what that means. Obviously, we forgot to ask again, but the comment was, "So it's hard for me to believe I actually found this amazing podcast. It's hard for us to believe you're writing that." Mrs. ADHD has gone through almost exactly the same stuff I've gone through and continue to experience in various ways. I've now listened to several of the podcasts and learned something from each one. Plus, I love your humour. It's just great. Thank you for the lifeline. We adored reading that, and we thank you ever so much when we read them all.
We did, and keep sending them in. But I've noticed Alex isn't picking the ones that mock him or criticize him in any way. He's just picking the ones that are nice about the podcast. So as usual, this dog's breakfast of a podcast is a tragedy in 3 parts. We choose a theme. In the last episode, we talked about how we adapt to an ADHD diagnosis. And in today's episode and in the following episode, we're really going to go back to basics, largely as Alex can only deal with things that are basic. And we're going to deal with the 2 arms of ADHD. So in this episode, we're going to talk about inattentiveness. And in the following episode, we'll talk about hyperactivity and impulsivity. The 3 parts are some pseudo-intellectual drivel rolled in glitter and presented as evidence-based psychoeducation by Captain Balloonhead, our personal reflections on inattentive symptoms, and some top tips, which will probably come from Alex, at least the useful ones. A quick sveki to our esteemed Latvian listeners, Al. We've got listeners in Latvia. We fucking made it.
Sveki to you all. James, tell me sveki isn't a slur.
I don't know. I've forgotten what it was, obviously. I think it's hello, but still.
Please be hello.
Please be hello. So, psychoeducation monkey that you are, if you could now ramble on incoherently for about 5 minutes, as usual, about inattentiveness.
Okay. As we've said many times, James, ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, which is officially the shittest named medical condition in the world, even worse than sphenopalatine ganglioneuralgia.
You looked that up, didn't you?
I don't need to, James. I teach at medical school. My job, I know all the medical things, apart from the leg stuff. Do you want to know what it is? Or do you already know what it is?
I do know, but I'm not going to tell you.
It's an ice cream headache, James, for which you need a break. So you've probably never had them, but other people get them when they eat ice. Anywho, back to ADHD, being a shit name. That first A, bless you, James, stands for attention. And the D is deficit, attention deficit. We do not have a deficit of attention. What we have is the brain has an inability to choose what we pay attention to, as well as the average person. So today's episode is normally about this concept of inattentiveness, inattention, or inattentivity, which isn't a word, but I like it. But really what it's about, it's about the diagnostic arm of ADHD that involves attention or focus in general and problems with that. So alongside having symptoms since childhood and for more than 6 months as an adult, and those symptoms making your life a bit of shit, there are 9 diagnostic areas for attention. And as an adult, you need to be positive, as in it has to be a problem, in at least 5 for a diagnosis. And that excludes the 9 that you need for hyperactivity, impulsivity, which we're going to cover next time. The 9 areas are, James, I don't think I can sit through 9 things. I'll try and say them all fast. Are you ready?
Yeah.
1, making careless mistakes, lacking attention to detail. 2, difficulty sustaining attention. C, being less able to listen when spoken to directly. 4, failing to follow through on tasks and instructions. 5, exhibiting poor organisational skills. 6, having a head the size and shape of a novelty balloon. Not the one. 7, losing things that are necessary for you to do tasks and activities. 8, being easily distracted, including having unrelated thoughts. 9, being forgetful in daily activities. 10, and finally, making careless mistakes, lacking attention to detail. How many of those do you recognise in yourself, James?
Well, if you take out the balloon-headed one, and then out of the 9, I was positive for 8 out of 9 when I got diagnosed, as I recall. So I recognise.
It's not a competition, James. If it was a competition, you would be losing. I mean, any competition on any subject.
That's not true. I won a prize once.
Was it in Ibiza last week, and was it for spelling banana correctly from a card? Anyhow, what's the evidence behind all this? Well, there's loads of evidence for something ADHD. I don't think this has happened before. There was a series of meta-analyses of the data, of the literature, of the science. And that means a meta-analysis is very meta. Someone has compared all of the science and done some science on what they found. It's a bit like how we rank all of your mucky websites, James, and come up with key themes you like donkeys. So it's a meta-analysis. Anyway, it found that people with ADHD had difficulties, small to moderate difficulties, with both focusing attention, which was from 22 studies and nearly 1,500 people, and also sustaining that attention, which was nearly 1,000 people and 13 studies. So focusing and sustaining attention were problems. The reasons we have problems with these with attention is that those areas of your brain that govern attention, such as the bit at the front and the outsidey bit, the prefrontal cortex, they're different in ADHD adults. And some of the networks of the brain, which connect up the different brain parts, they're not wired properly together. And the neurotransmitters that link them, such as dopamine, other ADHD neurotransmitters are available. These neurotransmitters are less active in these areas. And they know because they use up less sugar or brain fuel, and that's a shorthand way of saying they're less active. More interestingly, James, all humans, even man-chimpanzees like you, have brain networks, and they're like a spider's web of all structural joined-up bits. And they make the brain work in a certain way, and we develop them from birth, even before birth, to adulthood. 2 of these are increasingly seen as being important in ADHD. Boring word, klaxon, James. Klaxon.
Fucking hell.
These are the default mode network, default mode, DFN, and the task positive network, TPN, default and task. And we have to switch between these 2, which mean daydreaming, default, and busyness, task modes. Just think about your own life. Daydreaming, oh God, got to do something. So the default mode network is the daydreaming part of the brain. So we switch that off, or we're supposed to, when we have to do something important. And then the brain switches on the TPN, the task positive network. So you're driving around, the TPN's got to be on, the DFN off. The problem is, predictably, in ADHD, the DFN, the daydreaming mode, it doesn't deactivate as well as it should. So that means intrusive thoughts, daydreaming, mind wandering, all of which affect focus and attention on the task at hand. So add that to the lack of the action of dopamine, other neurotransmitters are available.
You're not funny, Alex. That joke, you've milked that joke twice now.
Your dad thinks I'm funny.
He doesn't know who you are. Just to cut in, what I think is interesting is I obviously agree with everything I wrote for that part. But do do drugs, the drugs that we take, as in medication, not the other drugs that we take, do they help with attention?
Yeah, they can. So the evidence says that methylphenidate, Concerta or Ritalin, something like that, the treatment for ADHD improves sustaining attention. And both methylphenidate and lisdexamfetamine have been shown to improve something they call the power of attention score, which I really like. So that's a repeated test over time to see if you're paying attention, obviously. And that, so the drugs help with those things.
So it makes sense, therefore, that's why they're used. One of the questions we get asked all the time is about the use of stimulants. People are very medication resistant at times because of the idea that it will either turn them into an automaton, or the fact that it's big pharma and giving kids Ritalin is bad. But actually, all the evidence is, at least in studies of short to 5 years, that you're looking at significant improvements in the deficits, if you like, associated with what you pay attention to. And I think that's why they're really powerful. Before we Karen, sorry, mate.
I just wanted to add actually that these studies are done by credible groups of scientists that are nothing to do with us, are they? And when the meta-analysis looks at those sorts of things, this isn't like a pharmaceutical company selling Ritalin and asking its patsy to do a study.
If anything, a meta-analysis, for those, which will be almost all of our audience that don't know what it is actually something that pharma companies often don't like, because what happens is an independent group of scientists add up all the individual participants from a series of studies into one big meta study and analyze the data. So what it can sometimes do is show that something doesn't work, and pharma companies fucking hate that. So actually it's a really good independent way of checking science. Just before we finish part one, I'd like to say that Alex has written "Take us to the bridge, Daddy-O" as my exit, which I obviously wasn't going to say, but it's so fucking annoying. I couldn't not say it. You live for this, don't you? I swear to God, it's your highlight of the week.
I really do. Can I apologise for my children screaming in the distance as well? James, take us to the bridge, Daddy-O.
Fucking see you in part two.
Welcome back to part two of podcast episode 28 of the ADHD Adults podcast. James is coughing, partly because he was laughing before we came in, and partly because I said podcast twice, I'm fairly certain. Welcome back. We are talking about inattentiveness, paying attention, or the lack thereof. Not the lack, of course, the difficulties in doing it. As always, our second part of the podcast is personal reflections on inattentiveness. James, hit us.
I'd fucking like to hit you. Right, personal reflection. So before my diagnosis, there are, which again was what, several years ago, even though you'd told me a long time before I probably had it. I obviously forgot. But before my diagnosis specifically, there were parts of my ADHD that I didn't know I did, but I'm imagining every fucking one else did, to be honest. So I genuinely did not know I had a short attention span. I didn't know this, largely because I can watch a film. I can sit in a cinema and watch a 3-hour film and pay attention to it. And I think that was my only measure of attention. The fact that in meetings I would be writing on other people's minutes or drawing pictures of cocks and insulting people in meetings for a laugh and not paying attention. It didn't come. I just thought, well, I'm being funny. Not that I just cannot bear listening to this person speak. So I genuinely didn't know I had a short attention span. When you phoned me that fateful day, Al, whenever it was, 6, 7, 8 years ago, one of the reasons I was surprised to hear that I might have ADHD, alongside the really embarrassing not knowing it was a thing as a scientist that teaches neurophysiology, one of the surprising things was that I had no fucking idea that I could have issues with attention, not a clue. And it kind of startled me a bit to think, what, I've got issues with attention. And I know you'll like this, Alex. I thought I was normal.
Holy shit!
And I know, and I know we don't use that word because it's wrong. No. But at the time, that was a word I thought was right, and I felt a little bit offended. I'm sorry. Before I did the ASRS test and looked at myself, I'm sorry. You think that I have an issue with attention? Of course I don't. And then of course I did the online test and went, oh yeah, I do all that stuff. I'd never thought about it.
No, your brain was always wild, wasn't it? You knew it was wild, right?
Yeah, but not, what is it? Wild peacefulness?
Peaceful wildness.
Fucking Christ. Yeah, my brain was always all over the place. The fact that I often stutter because my brain is 3 times faster than my mouth. The fact that, as we'll go through now, all the different areas, clearly I had issues with, but I genuinely didn't know. I was utterly unaware. So I know the 9 areas we've talked about. We've obviously taken out the 10th one, the novelty-shaped balloon head, because that's not, I believe, in the DSM diagnostic criteria, is it yet,
no,
Alex?
Not yet.
But when I ask myself honestly about them now, they all seem like classic James. That's shout out to Lee, who doesn't listen to the podcast, so I don't know why I said it. Classic Lee.
No. Hi, Lee.
Careless mistakes. Check all the fucking time. In fact, this week's game of What's James Forgotten Mislaid is about careless mistakes. Difficulty
to write it, please, Lord.
No. I've read it out. Don't worry. It's shit, but I've written it. Difficulty sustaining attention. Absolute check. To anything other than something that as we talked about, I find rewarding, like a film. Anything else, I've got shame at this because I love my family and my kind of wife's family, my in-laws, and my wife's family in particular are fucking hilarious, and spending time with them is so much fun. But I would go up there and within half an hour I'd be sat on my phone, and I didn't know I was doing this. And this would, Sam would be mortified afterwards and say, why are you even sat on your phone? You're with my family. And I'd think, I don't know, I didn't really notice I was doing it. Even in this incredibly fun, happy, joking environment, I couldn't pay attention looking back for more than about 20 minutes without the need to suddenly be on my phone. Being less able to listen when spoken to directly, massive check. Poor organization, why not? I could go on.
Can I ask you for the third one, the listening one?
Yeah.
How often have you had to hide that in work?
All the time. So I've got into trouble doing this. Now, partly I don't have great hearing, but partly because I don't listen. My default answer, which is like ludicrously stupid, is yes. So when somebody's been talking to me and I don't know what they've said, instead of saying, I'm ever so sorry I wasn't paying attention, which I'm much better at now, my default position is yes. And that's got me in trouble, Al. I mean, like serious trouble when I've had to then afterwards say, oh, no, I didn't mean yes. What I meant was I wasn't really listening to you. I've just agreed to do something that's highly illegal.
And now I'm the leader of Alternative for Deutschland and nationalism.
That is verbatim how that happened, Al. And it led to you signing up as well. So what I can say is I've learned and accepted now that I do these things. And that's a huge step towards feeling less shit because I didn't know I did these things. And then when you go through, as we talked about in last week's episode, when you go through this identity change and you start to realize that actually you're not a shit person, you're not unreliable, you're not flaky, or if you are, it's not your fault that you are. It's really important for you to be able to understand that you do these things. And I really didn't. So it's been important for me almost retrospectively, again, to drop that baggage for the things that I used to do based on my inability to choose what I pay attention to. Now, I don't know if you pay attention to all that, Alex, but what about you? What are your personal reflections?
Very similar again, James, really. Huge problems with inattentiveness. Huge problems.
Can I jump in there? But were you aware of them?
Good point. I don't know if we've talked about this much, but I had let's call it a massive mental breakdown in my 20s, well, years before diagnosis, where everything went wrong internally, not externally, and very few people knew. And a big part of it was me realizing that I was just shit worse than anyone else. And what I decided to do, because, I've got an ego, is build myself up from a position of humility, or try to, and think I'm shit at everything. So at least I don't have to hate anyone else. And so I think that led to me to be a reasonably good teacher because I always felt worse than everyone I was teaching. They've always got something better than me about them. So I could always, there was always respect there. So I always knew I was just terrible at this stuff. I didn't know it was an illness. And I have, like you, combined type. And so I've always scored badly on this one. But even before that, I knew that I just felt bad about myself, that any slow speech from someone, anybody speaking slowly, anything where I think I know what they're going to say, even if I get it wrong, my mind's gone. I completely wander. I used to feel so much shame about this. That shame's still there. It doesn't go away, but it's a lot better. There was something very, very wrong with me, James. In terms of me not caring about these people that are, speaking, I was just a selfish prick. I can't listen for 5 seconds to people I care about. I also grew up in a family that I describe as ADHD friendly. All right, guys. And a big, busy household of people who are fast and smart and rapid, and banter was a huge part of my upbringing and still is. So it almost always held my attention. There was never, do you know what I mean? No one was holding court on.
Was there? Can I ask quickly? Because obviously you're the least funny of 3 brothers. Was there an element of the competitiveness of that banter that helped you pay attention to it?
It was never competitive. It was almost like how we hugged, I think.
All right.
It still is. It still is.
Yeah.
I like nothing more than being with those guys because it's funny and they're very. We try not to talk about emotions if we can help it.
And not just uncompetitive because they're just objectively funnier than you.
Yeah. No, that's true. Yeah, no, I'm the obviously like remarkably handsome one. Oh, that's not even objectively true. No, I don't know why. It wasn't competitive. It was just bant. I think it's because life's so boring for a lot of ADHD adults outside in the world that to be in a place where it was never boring was my definition of safety. I think that's I need to take that to my therapist, James. It's a really good question, actually. I'm much better at listening with meds, but I still obviously have to care a little bit about the subject or the person or the outcome, but I can do it better. It still wouldn't help me, for example, if I had to listen to you, James, going on about your Derek Bowie music.
I mean, you pronounced his surname right, which
did I? I tried to do it wrong.
No, which has taken some of the sting out of that guy. But I've got to be honest, I'm still irked at Derek
because of the Derek. Is it Bowie?
Yes, it's Bowie, not Bowie. It's Bowie, as in a Bowie knife.
I am bored.
Well, good. It's what you deserve. Is that all your personal reflections, or are you going to bore us more? For a bit.
I'm done, James, unless you're going to make me play the game, then I'll carry on.
I am going to make you play the game. So now we've got a little bit of time in part 2 for the game, which I've got to be honest, even I'm getting a bit bored with. And that's What's James Lost, Mislaid, or Forgotten this week. And it's very poorly named this week because it's not about something I'm lost, but it is about something that's ADHD related. So you may remember, anybody that's on Instagram, and Alex from Conversations, that we recently had a new TV, which a satellite provider provides for you. And when they came to deliver it, 2 guys came and said, "Do you want us to install it?" And of course, being a fucking idiot, I said, no, I'll do it. And it took me a long while. I'm not going to tell you how long, but it turned out to be faulty. So I sent it back. And then when they came second time, they said, "Do you want us to install it?" So obviously this time I went, "Yeah, please install it." Now, the reason I was so bad at installing it was I obviously didn't pay attention to the instructions, read some of them, thought I knew better. So the question is, Alex, how much longer did it take me to install, and I did it incorrectly, a television than it took the installers? Did it, 1, take me 5 times as long? Did it 2 take me 10 times as long, or did it 3 take me 60 times as long?
This is an easy one, isn't it? It's definitely 60 because you are, and I think we can all agree, a fucking idiot.
Yeah, it is. It took me 3 hours, 3 hours to put together a television, which they did in 3 minutes.
Wow.
And I cried and I broke it a bit. And
after they'd left because you were jealous?
No. The first one that I put together, I couldn't get one of the screws to work, so I just kind of rammed it half in. And obviously it was devastating. And that's all because the instructions clearly printed on the box. I read the first one. They're quite small. My eyesight's not great. And I thought, it's obvious. You just put that in there and then stick that on there, and just couldn't do it or get it to work. 60 times as long. And another issue, it's not just the inattentiveness, is that weird when two people trained to do a job which you've paid for them to do turn up and you go, nope, I'll do it.
Oh,
For what
that
reason?
Is impulsively.
Absolutely, which is a nice segue into next week's episode. So that means you've got 10 points.
Oh, 10 out of 17. Can I add to people that you may do this yourself with ADHD and say, I can do that? There were studies that showed that adults with ADHD overinterpret their ability to finish tasks. They think they're better than they are. It's a really common thing.
Can we please do an episode on that and get Mrs. ADHD on? Because her utter confidence that she can do something that she has no training, skills, ability, or attention to do is unshakable. She sat for almost 6 hours cutting a hole in a wooden door to put a cat flap in when it was raining. And because she was adamant that she knew how to do it, when I came in after a while and she was covered in blood and crying and soaking wet, and the hole was so big we had to use brown Play-Doh to plug around it. But that's a thing she does so often. I'd love us to do it.
To be fair, I've had a builder that was worse than that.
That doesn't surprise me. Right, so 10 points, Al, double points. I'm
boom,
double digits. I'm gutted, and that takes us depressingly into the break before we come back with our top tips. So see you in a bit. Welcome back to part 3 of episode 28. Forgot for a second there, or didn't pay attention, of the ADHD Adults podcast, where we talk about our top tips. I've decided, because Alex normally goes second and therefore obviously looks inferior, to give him a chance, really. Give him a fighting chance.
Yeah.
So do you want to go first, Al? What are your top tips when it comes to attention and focus?
Thanks, James. I like going first. Sheer power, it's intoxicating. I've got a couple of things. One is, if you're feeling like you're paying attention and you want to pay attention, ask people that you're with to check that you are in receptive mode, receptive to what they need to tell you or want to tell you at the point. Because we have different abilities to pay attention, and it's dependent on lots of stuff. I mean, individually we do, let alone ADHD adults in general. What time of day it is, if you can see a squirrel in the garden, the excitement about something else in your life or something you want to say first. Ask them to check yourself, am I in receptive mode? Is really, really important. And then communicate that to people that matter. Because it isn't an excuse if you can't listen. It's a reason. And ADHD is a disability often of ability to pay attention. So it's actually setting you up for a fall if people kind of expect you always to be receptive and you're not. It isn't your fault. And align to that, really. If you're feeling the shame of, but I can watch the 3-hour film, I can do it sometimes, therefore I should always be able to do it, isn't how our brains are wired. Our brains are wired based on emotional reward, short-term emotional reward, and then not being able to pay attention just in general at the level that the average person does. And so thinking about that and accepting it, that's my top tip. And a practical tip for when you need to pay attention to something someone's saying, summarize what you're being told, either in your head, if you've got that kind of memory, or like me, just make notes and then maybe write down questions for the end. Okay, awful, selfish thing. Knowing I'm going to be able to ask a question at the end, I'm going to get to say something and show off, is more likely to increase my interest in it, because we're awful, selfish humans. Not really that last bit, but being a part of it, we don't make good spectators as a general rule, and all general rules are wrong, but we don't. And so involving yourself in it as a dialogue can increase dopamine, other neurotransmitters are available, James, can increase dopamine reward and engagement. So that is one way to sort of force engagement, is make yourself part of the conversation rather than just a passive listener. James, tips?
I now see why you don't like going second, because I actually agreed with at least one thing that you said, and that goes against my whole being, really.
Your raison d'etre, James?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, fuck's sake. I hate you. Yes, the thing that the thing that I agree with, Alex, is the mechanism, if you like, of asking people to check if you're in responsive mode. This is something that's really important, or receptive mode. This is really important because some people obviously don't disclose their ADHD. That's fine. It's a personal choice. But there is power in doing that, both in terms of protection in the workplace and in terms of communication with friends and family. And from my personal experience, that thing of being able to say, I'm not going to be able to pay attention to this, or I can't do this right now, or can you give me a bullet pointed list, etc. There's power in that. And people generally respond positively in my experience. So I think that getting other people to take on a little bit of responsibility, I think is really useful as a tip. In terms of my tips, so if you have either inattentive presentation or combined type presentation, we'll talk about that in the next episode when we move on to hyperactivity and impulsivity. The chances are that you'll recognize yourself, as I didn't, in most of the 9 areas of attention used for diagnosis. So my advice, balloon head accepted. So my advice, my tips, obviously don't do this, but something like this, or maybe this, is to use all the tools available to help you both focus your attention when you can, or make up for the deficits in attention that you've got. Get a dictaphone. That's a callback to the worst joke we made so far on this podcast. For meetings, use the Pomodoro technique or set timers so that you can make sure that you're focusing attention in short pads. Even adopt Alex's 1920s, pen and paper technique if you must. But there are so many different forms of technology, software, apps, smart speakers, pens and papers, which will help you either pay attention when you need to, if it's really important, but it's not emotionally rewarding, or make up for deficits in attention when you're in a situation where you're not going to focus or be able to pay attention. And obviously, blah, blah, emotional acceptance, blah, blah, happier person. All that
the makeup for blah blah. That is every podcast ends with the emotional acceptance. Yeah. How? So making up. I like that. Make up for the deficits is a way to switch the narrative from masking, isn't it? That shame of pretending and hiding and working really really hard to destroying yourself, to burnout, really, because you're so ashamed of what you've done. Instead, find ways, including just communicating with the people that matter, to make up for the deficits, not mask them. I really like that. James, for one, somebody else probably wrote it for you, I imagine.
Yeah, no, I stole it from a website. Fab. So this is probably the most agreeable sub part of an episode we've done. I know it's awful. Well, I know we did that episode where we liked each other, pretended to like each other.
Oh yeah.
God, I hated that. Anyway, thank you for. Actually, I did the second part. Thank you, James, for sharing your top tips.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Alex. The script is the wrong way around now, obviously. We'll finish the product recommendation, which is better than last week's tattoo, and that is all the apps, all of them. Your phone, unless you're from Shoreditch, is probably a smartphone, and therefore it contains the ability for you to use so many different apps which can help. We've got a list of just some of them on our website, adhdadult.uk, on the resources page, and we'd like you to send us examples of apps which help you. Some of them are as simple as to-do lists, some of them are specifically for tracking symptoms, etc. But there are so many different apps which can help you, as Alex said, not have to mask, but instead support those deficits in attention that you have so that you can be more functional and therefore happier.
And remember to ditch apps when they stop working for you. It's okay, no guilt. We say that these apps work for a reason, for a season, or for life, and that's okay. And some of the ones that work once for a reason might come back again, they might not. And we're not ordinary people, so we can't just put one thing in place and have that forever. It doesn't work like that.
Do we say that?
Oh, I meant me and my friends.
Oh, your friends.
yeah.
This is the Henry VIII Appreciation Society, where you meet sipping tea, talking about which of his wives was the one that definitely didn't deserve to be decapitated or something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do want to talk about that. Can we?
Well, no, we're not going to. I am interested, though. This is just as we get to the end of episode 28 of our podcast, The ADHD Adults Paying Attention, that we've waited all episode for a shit paying attention dad joke. So anything else?
Sorry, James, what did you say? I wasn't listening.
Brilliant. I hate you. As usual, contact us on the socials if you'd like to get in touch, if you've got any questions or suggestions for future episodes. It's been, I'd like to say a pleasure, but that would be a gross fucking lie. We'll see you next time.
Bye all.